Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I think this is the last session. I don't want to keep you too long, but starting off with, a big thank you for the opportunity to be here. I came in a little late, but the last two, Ambassador Kim's presentation and Hannah's discussion, I thought was fascinating. I could go on listening to it for as long as you have it. And particularly this conversation about the exchange with Myanmar, I think if that happens, it'll be fascinating. We in WRI India will be very happy to host the Myanmar delegation coming here from the NGOs. Now, with that, let me say that my mandate is to speak on a very narrow component of whatever you've been discussing all day. It's just looking at mobility, and that to mobility in India. But I'll try to present very briefly what are the problems we are facing in mobility and what are some of the emerging paradigms, some of the emerging directions, and what I see as a possible future of mobility in India, what's the direction we're heading towards. I will cover a little bit about what are the challenges in moving in that direction, also what could possibly be done to get around some of these challenges. So that's broadly what I'm going to cover in this last session. Let me just understand this a little better. Okay, so first, why is transport important? Why is mobility important? When the Smart Cities program was being framed in India, initially there was no coverage on mobility. Mobility didn't find place. So that's the time we had to argue as to why mobility is important in cities and how you can't ignore mobility. It connects people to jobs, it connects people to education, it connects people to healthcare. People come to cities to pick up jobs, and if you can't connect them to jobs, then what's the point of their coming to cities? So mobility is important from that perspective. It connects goods to markets. Often people say that cities are the engines of economic growth in this country. But if cities are the engines of economic growth, then I think the mobility system are the wheels of that engine. And if that wheel doesn't move, the engine doesn't move. There's another example I tend to give is the mobility system is like the circulatory system in the human body. And if the mobility system doesn't work, the city will end up dying like a human body will die if the blood system doesn't move. So that's the importance of mobility. Finally, it also provides a framework around which a city could grow. Most cities have grown around a transport system. So cities have grown around rivers, cities have grown around railway lines. Bombay has grown around a railway line. But once the personal motor vehicle came in, you didn't need that. The car could take you wherever you wanted to go. So that's been a problem with the IC engine and the personal motor vehicle. But otherwise, cities have grown around mobility systems. So the problem that we face in India, this graph actually captures the big problem that we're facing in India, and I think the problem is the growth in the number of registered motor vehicles. You see somewhere from around early 80s, when the Maruti came in as a totally new thing in the country, fuel-efficient cars, and then you had the fuel-efficient motorbikes, where a scooter which would earlier give you about 35 kilometers to a liter, suddenly you found that you were getting 80 kilometers to a liter, and much fancier vehicles, nice looking and very pleasing vehicles came in fairly cheap and massive mileage. That's when this explosive growth started happening. And this doesn't seem to be coming down. The result of all this has been, in this country from 1981 to 2011, this 30-year period, saw a roughly 77% growth in the population, but a 2,500% growth in the number of registered motor vehicles. That's the kind of massive growth that has taken. The result is this. Now, if I ask you which city is this, you'll probably be able to give the answer looking at those signboards. But if I didn't have the signboards and you gave any city, I would say you're right. But that's the problem in almost all the cities in the country today. Yet another picture of the kind of problem. We said, okay, maybe this would get resolved by building flyovers. We built flyovers and got this on flyovers. I could go on, whatever solutions we tried to come up with, and the same problem continued despite whatever solution we thought of. The message that I'm trying to convey through this is you really cannot build our way out of congestion. We have to manage our way out of congestion, which is very different from building our way out of congestion. Why did this happen? We see so many vehicles, but are there really that many people? This is why this happened. We've been greedy. I mean, I don't need more than 2 feet by 2 feet space on the road to move, but I decide to move in a car which occupies something like 18 or 20 square feet of space, just so that someone like me can move in that space. This is a picture of how we've been greedy in occupying space, and that's why we see the kind of impact on the roads that we have today. And a lot of people talk about, resource-efficient transport systems are those which would occupy much less space, consume much less energy, and emit much less pollutant. And this is an example of the road space that is occupied. These 3 pictures that you see here, are the same number of people. In one of them, they're moving in cars. In the other, they're moving in buses. And the first one, they're all walking. And it shows you how much road space is occupied by the same number of people using different modes of travel. So obviously, the most resource-efficient transport system is either walking or public transport, not personal cars. Now, with this background, the efforts that we need in this country today are really, what has happened so far is as income has grown, people have moved transport systems in this direction. So from public transport or walking, they've moved to two-wheelers or old second-hand cars, and then as they got higher income, they moved to their own cars. And what we need today is really a reversal of that. This is the direction that we need to take. Now, the National Urban Transport Policy, which was formulated in 2006 and adopted in that year, has really recommended investments in public transport and non-motorized transport. That's the national policy as it exists. And as a result of that, a number of rail and bus-based public transport systems have come up. A lot of investment has been made in this. Unfortunately, our experience is that riderships have not been as good as they should have been. We built metro systems expecting much higher ridership than what we are actually seeing in a number of cities around the country. And why has this happened? Part of the reason that we feel is our public transport systems have been designed for those who cannot afford a personal motor vehicle. So quality has not been as important in our thinking. Affordability has been the most important factor in our thinking. So we must have public transport systems that are affordable. People can, suffer some amount of crowding. People can afford to go a certain amount of distance. Quality has not been that important. Affordability has been the most important. But in today's paradigm, we want people who can afford their own personal motor vehicles to also use public transport. If we want to do them, you have to give certain features to public transport systems that personal motor vehicle owners would want if they have to shift to public transport. And that's why I say that the way we've thought our public transport systems really needs to be reimagined. And in reimagining this, we have to look at what do personal motor vehicle users want. Some of the features that they're really looking for are, I want a variety of services. I don't want the same kind of bus service. I don't want the same kind of, one standard service. I want a variety that will meet different needs. I'll come to a little more of this. I want it to be available on demand. I don't want to be limited by a certain schedule. I want it to be available when I want it. I want the convenience of door-to-door service. It should pick me up close to my home, or at least close to my home, and drop me close to where I want to go. I want it to be reliable. It should come in 5 minutes if I want it to come in 5 minutes. I shouldn't have crowding. I should have no hassles of having to struggle to get into, say, the Delhi metro is often a struggle to get into. I don't want that kind of crowding. It should be easy to board, alight for women, children, for everyone. It should be quick, fast. It should be safe, clean, and affordable. Now, is this asking for too much? Now, in response to all this, or with all these demands, the critical thing is they're willing to pay a higher price. You don't have to be caught up with this affordability factor for this group of people. And this is where I think the emerging paradigms in mobility need to be leveraged. Technology, which is coming in such a big way on transport systems, needs to be leveraged. Now, what are some of these emerging paradigms that are coming up? One is moving from limited options to multiple options. If you look at Uber and Ola, they're not just giving you one service. You have the Uber pool, you have the Ola pool, you have a variety of services. You can take it for the whole day, you can take it for just one trip. You can, the multiple options that they are offering to you. This is what we want. People with different needs and different kinds of demands and different payment capacities would want this kind of variety. So this is what we need to start seeing in our public transport system. So from limited options to multiple options. You're moving from a paradigm of owning the car to owning a ride. Today, a personal car, my car for example, is used for only 5% of the day. 95% of the day it's parked using up valuable urban space. 95% of the time it's just using up space and providing no service. So the paradigm that is emerging is, why do I need to own a car? All I need is to own a ride. So this is what Uber and Ola and others are doing. They're giving you that ownership of a ride when you want that ride. Rest of the time, it's serving somebody else. Then, of course, this is a technological change that is happening, moving from the IC engine to the electric vehicle. That's the other big change that's happening, which will create huge changes in how we move around, how we think of the motor vehicle. It's not something that you fill in gas one day and don't have to bother about filling it in for the next 5 days. You probably have to charge the vehicle every day if you move to an electric vehicle. So this is again going to create big changes in how people think of motor vehicles. Then you're moving from, particularly on public transport, if you look at things around the world, it's either primarily publicly operated services, publicly owned and publicly operated services like DTC in Delhi and number of other states in India where you have publicly owned companies, or you have private operators running services across the city. This is dominant in many cities in Africa. It was dominant in many cities in Latin America. Today, that paradigm globally is changing to more of a PPP approach, a public-private partnership approach. We've seen some of that in Delhi. Some of the cities in India have also been thinking of, have been operating on a public-private partnership approach. Many cities in Latin America have moved to a PPP approach, but that is what is happening around the world. Rather than being purely public or purely private, it's looking at a PPP approach, where the public sector designs the network and the private sector operates services on that network. You're moving from a paradigm of supply management to demand management, meaning when the demand goes up, earlier we used to increase supply or increase road capacity or increase the number of buses to meet that increased demand. Today the paradigm is also moving towards trying to look at reduced demand. How do we manage demand better so that it can fit into the existing supply infrastructure that is available? You're moving from a concept of users pay to beneficiaries pay. What this means is earlier public transport systems got their revenues by charging a fare to people who use it. But today the paradigm is there are many people who don't use it but are also beneficiaries of the system. So somehow these beneficiaries should also be made to pay for that investment. So for example, people who own property close to metro stations may not be using the metro, but property values have gone up significantly because of that metro system. So somehow they should also be made to contribute to that investment. So the idea of moving from users pay to beneficiaries pay. We move from a system of manual information systems to IT-based information systems, where these IT-based information systems give you data so rapidly and give you analysis so rapidly that you can actually change operating parameters based on the kind of data that you have. Manual systems didn't give you that arrangement. And finally, you're moving from independent systems to connected systems, where a metro system is not a standalone system, it's connected to the bus system, it's connected to land use. So a whole lot of interconnections within these transport systems is becoming extremely important. So these are some of the emerging paradigms, and what I was trying to argue is that these paradigms need to be leveraged in how we look at mobility in the future. So what we see around the world is really a convergence of 4 global trends. One is electric mobility, shared mobility, connected mobility, and then what they are talking of as autonomous vehicles or driverless mobility. I think this is the paradigm of new mobility. In India, what we are expecting is the electric and shared convergence would happen. Connected has happened or is happening. Driverless, I think, is still a little time away, but at least these 3 of connected, electric, and shared is the convergence that we are looking for in mobility going forward. Now, what's happening? These new mobility paradigms, how do we leverage them? One of the things that we need to do is think of widening the definition of public transport. Metro systems and bus systems alone are not public transport. You have other forms of public transport. So, going beyond what is known as fixed route and fixed schedule services. So Uber and Ola are also in a form public transport. They are not vehicles that you own yourself. They are publicly owned vehicles which are providing a public service. So the definition of public transport, I think, needs to get widened. There has to be a variety of services. It cannot be one standard service. Some time ago there was a meeting in a ministry which is doing a lot of work with the Delhi government, and the Delhi government is thinking of increasing the number of buses by another 5,000 or 6,000 buses. The question that came up is, yes, Delhi does need another 5,000 or 6,000 buses, but what kind of buses? Should they be the same kind of buses that are being used today, or do we need to think of another level of service to increase public transport? So these are the kind of questions that are coming up in creating varieties of services to meet different needs. You have to facilitate availability on demand through apps. Now, apps don't have to be used only for taxis, only for Ubers and Olas. Apps can also be used for, say, minibuses, small buses, micro-transit as the world knows of them. You can book a seat in a small bus going from place A to place B, and the bus routes, they change based on what the demand is like. Then innovative financing, basically when you're looking at public transport as being affordable, and public transport also having quality, there is a trade-off between quality and cost. And can you think of new revenue sources that will help balance this trade-off? Integrated systems with easy transfers. So a bus system is integrated with a metro system. You get off from a metro, you have a bus waiting for you. This needs integrated planning. This needs integrated data exchange. So this is the kind of thing that you need through integrated system. Now in Delhi, you have a bus system, you have a metro system. They don't talk to each other. The same ticket can't be used on both. This is what needs to change. And it is happening in some other cities in the country. Kochi, for example, has done this very well. The last thing is looking at, sorry? Okay, let's come back to the discussion after I finish the presentation. I'll be good to know what Delhi has done on this. Best of my knowledge, no, but anyway. Now, the other thing that is coming up is how do we take metro rail systems to people's doorsteps? And this is happening in 2 different ways. One is you're looking at creating densities around metro stations, which is the concept of transit-oriented development. Also the concept of creating feeder networks, which are bus systems and other systems that connect metro systems or metro stations closer to where people live and work. So 2 different directions in which you can try and take the metro closer to people's doorsteps. So these are some of the ways in which the emerging paradigms can be leveraged to improve public transport systems. If you look at electric vehicles, I'll just go into a little bit, there has been a growth in the number of electric vehicles, but still it's a very small fraction of the total vehicular fleet around the world. China has been a leader in this, and a number of manufacturers have announced very ambitious electric mobility targets. Gives us confidence that electric mobility would be the order of the day going forward. Some of the drivers of this electric mobility growth has been the falling battery prices, have been the increasing energy density of batteries, the increasing share of renewables in the electricity mix in the country, because a lot of people feel that with coal-based electricity generation, what are the climate benefits that come up? Well, you don't get them unless you start seeing a higher share of renewables and clean energy in your energy mix. And then the emergence of shared mobility has also been something that has been driving electric vehicle growth, because longer usage is more economical with electricity, higher capital cost, lower operating costs. So things like the shared mobility options are more economical with electric drives. Now, India is also keen to move towards electric mobility, as is demonstrated by a number of initiatives. The Ministry of Heavy Industry has a FAME 1, now a FAME 2 program, which provides financial incentives to move towards electric mobility. There have been initiatives taken up to establish charging stations to promote this. The Energy Efficiency Services Limited has taken up initiatives to have aggregated purchases for electric vehicles, particularly for use by government departments. A number of states have also come up with EV policies. Of course, firm roadmaps have yet to emerge, but at least the policies are one step in that direction. So Kerala, Delhi, Telangana, Maharashtra, some examples of states that have come up with this. I know a number of other states are working on this. Goa, Punjab, and many others are working in this direction. I mean, electric mobility, really, EV talk has been big in 2017. And this is just some sampling of headings, and this kind of conversation is really just building up. Some examples of shared mobility that you see in India: Ola and Uber are, cab operators, but I know that Uber has now started operating public transport systems in Egypt. In India itself, you have a number of other smaller players working on micro-transit. So you have City Flow, you have, Ola Shuttle, you have Shuttle itself, which is operating in Delhi and the Gurgaon region. ZipGo, Commute are some examples of micro-transit systems across the country, which have been emerging. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that technology has enabled new forms of mobility to emerge. These are things that we could not think of earlier, but really the use of technology in transport systems has allowed this to happen. This is what persuades us to rethink our transport systems, how to make them more resource efficient, not use up space needlessly in parking, not use up space in systems that do not carry enough people. How do we make them resource efficient? So, to my mind, these emerging paradigms are a step in the right direction. We need to embrace them. Unfortunately, our regulations today are a little discouraging of these kind of new things that have been coming up. There's always a time gap between new technologies, new paradigms, and regulations. It takes time for regulations to catch up. One of the arguments we have been making is this is the need of the hour. You have to embrace them, not shun them. So this is something that is really moving ahead. And the basic principle is an empty seat in any moving vehicle is a wasted resource. It's a carrying capacity that has not been used. Energy has been consumed. Road space has been consumed. Emissions have taken place, but that empty seat has been a wasted resource. How do we make sure that no empty seat is there on any moving vehicle? And finally, this is the paradigm, is think of mobility as a service. Mobility doesn't need personal ownership of a vehicle. There is a service which you can tap whenever you want. Think of mobility as a service. And this is the paradigm on the basis of which Helsinki has come up with this plan of, private car ownership is going to be obsolete by 2025. Can we think of something like this in India, maybe 2030, 2050, whatever it is, but mobility as a service? And to my mind, the younger generation is really leading the way. I own a car, but my daughter refuses to buy a car because she says, why do I need a car? I can get an Uber whenever I want. I can use an auto rickshaw whenever I want. I don't need a car. I think the younger generation is more enamored by the smartphone than the car. My generation was different. So the challenges in doing this, to my mind, in the Indian context is fragmented governance. We have too many different agencies involved in transport. I had a slide to show which are the different agencies in Delhi involved with transport. I thought I didn't want to make it too long, but there are at least about 15 to 18 different agencies involved with transport systems in Delhi. So fragmented governance is a big challenge. Our regulatory framework is a little outdated. We need to rethink the regulatory framework. I think lack of open data systems and the reluctance to share data is a mindset problem that we need to think of. Kochi took it up very nicely, and the Kochi Metro has now opened up its data systems, as a result of which it's available for anyone to use. So essentially, this fragmented responsibility for transport needs to come together in the form of a lead institution that must take comprehensive responsibility for transport. There has been a talk about a unified metropolitan transport authority for quite some time. The policy of 2006 also recommended setting this up in every city. Cities have been struggling to set it up. It hasn't really come up in a big way in any city so far, but hopefully this will happen. So as I see, the likely future of mobility in India is metro rail systems with good last mile connectivity and transit-oriented development. This is a direction that is moving. The Ministry of Urban Development has come up with policies in this direction. A wider set of shared mobility options. We are seeing much more than what we saw a few years ago. I think dominance of the electric vehicle is what's going to be visible soon. A dominance of multiple private operators providing a variety of services is what's likely to be visible. A declining sense of, trend of personal motor vehicle ownership. As I said, the newer generation, younger generation, is not looking at owning personal motor vehicles. So a declining trend of personal vehicle ownership is likely to be seen. And finally, a lead entity that will drive mobility as a service, I think, is the way in which we'll be going forward. And I think the youth in India are showing the way for this. This is all I had for this presentation. Thank you very much. We have some questions if anyone has, or you had something on.
Agarwal, you have not given space for cyclists.
Sorry,
For short distance, so there is a trend in the Europe and developed country, people use cycle. And there is a dedicated, road passage for cycle. But in Delhi or in metro city in India, that is not there. And another point is,
can we just, is it possible
recently,
to switch off that light? I'm not able to.
Recently, in Lahore, in Pakistan, our neighbor, they have used a very novel method, and they have devised, donkey-driven cart. Donkey-driven cart, which has given employment to 10,000 persons in Lahore. They earn 1,100 Pakistani rupees. 100 rupees is spent for feeding the donkey, and 1,000 is the saving. It has given employment. Youngster, college-going girls, boys, they enjoy ride in Lahore. If you want, I have the video with me. So what is your opinion about that?
I don't know much about this. I don't know enough, but if you can share some information, that will be very useful. Yes.
Eco-friendly and very safe, saving in the petrol, diesel. There's a lot of advantages.
If you can share some information, I may be able to give a view on that. Yeah. Yes, another one there.
One thing more. The shared pooling or using vehicles transportation on a shared basis, I think there is one more thing to be covered, that is the upcoming crime rate, which hinders people's will to allow people to share their transports on a very voluntary basis. I think that also has to find a place when we are talking about transportation, because many of the sharing can happen because the rising rate of crime is hindering the will of people towards this, and there has to be some measures for it.
Absolutely. I think this is a very interesting point. You see, one of the things that I've been, when you share a small car, you're sharing it with just one other person, or maybe two other people, and you are a little, worried about who's the other person. You're sitting rather close to the other person. That's why I think something like small buses, which would carry, say, 6 or 7 people, and the seats are a little further away from each other. A lot of women have told me that that's the kind of vehicle they wouldn't mind taking. But if you take one of these taxis, which are small, sharing it with another person, you feel a little, hesitant doing that. So I think your point is absolutely right. Sharing a small vehicle may be a little more difficult. So if you have slightly larger vehicles, maybe even something like an Innova could carry 3 or 4 people, or a mini bus, which could carry, say, a tempo traveler kind of thing, which could carry 8 or 9 people, to my mind may be more acceptable than just taking. But sharing need not be thought of only as how many people are using that vehicle at the same point of time. Sharing could also be one person using it at different points of time, so that you're not wasting parking resources. So I use it for one trip, someone else uses it for another trip. I think that's also an effective sharing.
I have a question. I'm Vinny Sharma from Forrester Research. My basic point is that as far car ownership is concerned, it is considered as a sort of a status symbol, and the government and corporates are not taking initiative in it. It is considered, that in case of the bureaucrats they go in a fancy car, same with the case with corporate CEOs. In Europe and other countries, even in China, they are going with the public transport, So point number one. Point number two, as far as Ola, Uber are concerned, in the starting, to gain market share, they allure these, people with attractive pricing. But after that, they also raise their tariffs, we can see it in the monsoon and all. So that is also, not causing a kind of a barrier, as far as this.
Agreed. Completely agreed with you. You see, this is personal motor vehicle ownership is a status symbol. That's absolutely right. I mean, it was a status symbol. I'm wondering whether it's the same status symbol even for the younger generation. And that's where I'm having doubts. In my organization, I'm the only one who goes in a car. All the others are youngsters. They don't take the car. They either take the metro or come on a shared taxi. You don't agree with what you're saying. Please come to my office. I welcome you. Come and have lunch with me. Talk to about 30 other people who are there in my office.
But I can show you the family where there are 5 cars.
There may be 5 cars in some
Each member
families.
has a car.
That may be true in some cases, but I'm telling you an example where my own daughter refused to buy a car. I told her I'll pay for it. She was working in Bangalore. She's a lawyer like you. She refused to buy a car. Why do I need a car? Finally, she said, okay, you want to spend some money on me, get me a good smartphone. I don't want a car. So instead of 5 lakhs, I spent 50,000 and she was very happy. Now, I know people who got fancy cars because they had an interest in cars. Now they find it so convenient. He got a Toyota Corolla, which I can't afford. He bought one and sold it off now. He says, I don't need it anymore. That's the change that I'm seeing happening. My wife decided we had 2 cars. Just like you're saying, 5 people have 5 cars. We had 2 cars because my wife had her own travel and I had my own travel. Then she said, look, I'm not traveling all that much. The few trips when we are not going together, I can take something else and go. We sold off 1 car. So this is the direction I'm seeing closely amongst people that I'm associated with. I know that there are houses where you have 5 people and 5 cars, but you're seeing this trend of declining car ownership. So I have a feeling that this status symbol issue may be changing. And today when I show you this data about the vehicle registration numbers going up, this is total number of registered vehicles. I have a suspicion, I don't have the exact data, but I have a suspicion that a large share of these new vehicles getting registered are shared taxis, not so much of personal motor vehicles. How many? We are not talking of Mukesh Ambani here. He's one family. I think less than 0.5%. We're not talking of Mukesh Ambani's here.
And about fares rising, we see that Delhi Metro's fares were raised, We saw the car ownership going up, and people taking more cars, Ola, Uber raising their tariffs.
They moved from Delhi Metro because fares went up. And this is where my argument on this is, Delhi Metro has been thinking of their revenue only coming out of fares. Have they thought of other sources of earning money? Right? So, you see, huh? Those are small amounts. The big money, you look at Hong Kong. Where is Hong Kong earning its money from? It's earning its money from property. Today, if the Hong Kong Metro charges no fare, they're still in profits. Has the Delhi Metro thought of property as a source of revenue? Big source of revenue, much more than what they'll get by way of fares. So this is what I mean by innovative financing. If you say that my expenditure is going to be so much, so many people are using the metro every day, so this is what I must charge to break even. That's not the way to do it. You know, if you ask me, fare fixation is something, there are two things to it. You know, one is, what is the fare you charge from a passenger? That's a public policy issue. How much you need to pay the operator to break even on their costs is a technical issue. It depends on the technology, it depends on fuel efficiency, that's a technical issue. But how much you charge from a person, from a passenger, is a public policy issue. There could legitimately be a policy saying that public transport will be free because there are other social benefits. Delhi Metro's fares are not fixed on that basis. It's fixed on the basis of how much it costs me, how much should I get to be able to break even. To me, that's not the way to fix fares. Sorry, if you can.
Just commenting on that, because a recent trip to Geneva is just arriving, you get given free transportation around the city, and you know that's a bonus. And I didn't take a taxi once. I mean, their infrastructure and their transport is so good that why you have a free ticket.
Yes.
It's a very good example.
Any other or?
The drivers, like DTC, so safety is also one of the issues. So there any data study?
Safety is very important. That's why, you know, the other point that you mentioned about Olas and Ubers initially came in, but then later started raising their fares. That's because regulation is yet to bring them in. And this is where I think there's a regulatory gap. Regulations need to start coming in so that they come under some discipline. Today, that is very fuzzy. So that's the problem. And more so when you look at a lot of these services, I showed a slide with Shuttle and some of the others, they are actually in violation of the Motor Vehicles Act. Because they are not a stage carriage, they are not a contract carriage, but they are somehow functioning with some kind of to me, they are a very good service. That's the kind of service we need. That's where regulation needs to start coming up and bringing them under a regulatory ambit. So this problem will get sorted out. Now there is a new Motor Vehicles Act which is in Parliament, somehow has got into a bit of a political debate, but I think that new Motor Vehicles Act is addressing some of these issues. Okay, thank you very much.